Welcome back, gents. I just finished my second range trip with Shooter's World Match Rifle Powder, and I wanted to go over my results with you. I don't have any video, so it's not going to be very dynamic, but I took some snapshots of my results, and let's go over them. Two caveats. One thing I have in the very front of my mind doing this testing is that for trip 1, this is first fired Lapua brass. So this is not fire-formed brass. I wanted to see is how valid is it to use non-fire-formed brass when doing load development. We'll see when we get out to the second range trip, the data, the results for that. Point number 2 is that I'm doing 10-shot strings for this load development. And for this first range trip, you can already see we're going up by 0.5 grains, that's pretty large steps, but I feel both of those together really show the harmonics of the barrel and how it's manifesting with our shot groups. Because if we would have used, I meant to say, smaller sample sizes, okay, so go ahead and say that, not that these are necessarily large, we would have missed out on some trends. So that said, let's take a look at our results for range trip 1. So we went from 22.5 to 24.5. So that's only 2 grains, but again, we're going up in pretty big steps. That first group, 22.5, that's pretty much garbage. Like, that's pretty terrible. That's a solid 2-inch group, maybe a little bit more. And it almost looks like we have triple grouping going on there. It's pretty bad. When we go up to 23 grains, now things really tighten up in general, speaking in terms of like the mean radius accuracy, like the relation of the bullet holes to one another. 9 of the 10 shots are grouped up to the upper right, pretty close to that center ring. Although when you even look at that group, it's a little bit horizontal. It's actually about 1.5 inches. But when you look at that flyer included down below, shot number 10, that was not, by the way, the 10th shot. I can't remember which number shot that was, but when you look at it in comparison to the previous one, it's a harmonically induced flyer. Look where the bullets are landing. So this is on the border of some sort of node, an accuracy node, I dare say. When we go up to 23.5 grains, we can see we still have that horizontalness going on. The group is opening up. It's back to about 2 inches, a little over. But again, look, we have a flyer that's manifesting to, well, in the lower part, but also to the right, which when we go up on yet another jump to 24 grains, you can see the group, it's tightened up again to about a little under about 1.5 inches, but it's vertical. But look at the lower part of that verticality. Look where those shots are landing. Then look at the previous group. They're landing in the same area. So that's not a shooter-induced flyer. That's a harmonically induced flyer. Kind of interesting. And then when we get to our last charge that we use, the upper charge, 24.5, there in the lower left, we can see that we have some of the similar verticality. The point of impact is generally moving to the right, but it's still, it's turning into an uglier group. If we would have went up higher, if we could have even, it probably would have gotten worse. So we can see in very broad terms how we're going from a bad node to something that's tightening up to a bad node again. Now, the extreme accuracy, I'm going to go ahead and use that term, but the extreme distance, when you're measuring how well the group did from the 2 furthest parts, that actually hasn't changed too much in all these groups. The dispersion, the absolute dispersion, we'll go ahead and call it, hasn't changed much. There is a little bit of change, but it's not a great change. But the mean radius of things, so in other words, the where the bullet holes are appearing on the paper, where the shots are actually landing, that is definitely being affected. And so that's where we see like our harmonic and accuracy nodes opening up, closing, opening up, closing. I thought it was very interesting. So now day 2, what I decided to do is basically repeat everything, but go in 0.2 grain increments. Okay, trip number 2. Quick note here. Notice how much brighter the picture is. The weather conditions were totally different. Day 1, I had snow, changing winds, gusts of from 8 to 12 miles an hour. It was pretty bad shooting conditions. Visibility was okay, but there were some days where there were some times when trying to line up the crosshairs was actually pretty difficult. On the bright side, my gun in general stayed quite cool because of all the wind and snow. But with trip number 2, I had none of those problems. There was still wind, but it was coming from the right at a constant anywhere from 5 to 8 miles an hour, we'll go ahead and call it. So let's take a look at the results. And you can see here, again, 0.2 grain increment steps. We have a lot of similarities with trip 1. So 22.5, look at that. That group looks awful. It doesn't, it almost looks like a triangle in a weird way. It's a kind of a double grouping pattern. And when we go up to 22.7, look, it's pretty bad as well. The extreme spread or the absolute accuracy, I need to come up with a better term for that, but the edge-to-edge accuracy of that group, it is better. And it's actually not completely terrible. It's just shy of 2 inches. That's definitely better than, looks like almost 3 inches for that first group. Kind of interesting how it opened up on the second day when the weather was so much better. But I think part of that is because, again, one of the things we're keeping in the front of our mind is that this is actually fire-formed brass. Anyway, so 22.7, it's still kind of a terrible group, though, in the grand scheme of things. And we got this double grouping basically going on. I almost see like 2 vertical strings going on there. When we go up to 22.9, things kind of still have a little bit of that triangle look to them, but things are starting to tighten up, it looks like, or become more predictable. The group is still roughly about a 2-inch group, so it hasn't really improved, but I just like the look of it a lot better. And then when we jump up to 23.1, things tighten up by quite a bit. At least it looks a lot more predictable. But again, when you take a look at the edge-to-edge accuracy there, it's actually about 1.5 inches. So it's a lot better than 22.5, which we'll go ahead and call the scatter node. And this can be the accuracy node. But overall, it's not the greatest group, but definitely it looks a lot better than the preceding ones. And then when we jump up to 23.3, we can see that the group is starting to open up, and furthermore, you can see that there is a flyer to the lower right there, which I'm guessing is probably harmonically induced. Speaking of flyers, you may have noticed this one on the second group to the lower left. I just indicated it. Yeah, that was me. So go ahead, pause the video, compare the results of the second range strip to the first one. I find that there is a lot of similarities, and also remember that all the groups from range strip 2, they're going to correspond with the first 3 groups of range trip 1, because that's the approximate powder range. Again, I find there is a lot of similarities. However, one difference I do notice is the shift of the center of the points of impact. I find for the range trip 2 that generally we're going downward, but also a little bit to the right, which is not really the case in the first range trip. If I remember correctly, there are some points where we're going more upwards. Why that was? The first range trip, it did have different atmospheric conditions. The wind was changing and switching. Also, the air was less dense. The barometric pressure was down, whereas day 2, it was 20 degrees warmer and the pressure was up. That might play a factor. also, the second range day, it's fire-formed brass. I'm sure that plays a little bit of a role. However, with considering how similar they are to one another, I'm actually not going to have a problem really using not fire-formed brass for my load development. I mean, it's something I'm going to pay attention to. It's something I'm going to have in the front of my mind, just like with this range trip. But it actually kind of surprises me how similar they are to one another. Actually, one quick last note. Let's run these targets through range buddy, or at least our extremes for our precision. So we have our worst group compared with our best group. And you can see here the best group is basically half the size. Well, for this sample size. You have 1.89 compared to 0.99, and that's equally reflected in their mean radius. We have 0.7 compared to 0.36. So literally almost 100% difference in the size of the groups. Now, would this 100% difference in group size, we'll go ahead and call it, always be maintained? Like if we were to run this test again, would the groups necessarily be 100% difference in group size? Or if we were to run 100 rounds of 25 or 22.5 versus 23.1, I don't think so, but I can't say for certain what it exactly would be the difference. What I'm really trying to say here is if you pay attention to what your rifle is trying to tell you, if you pay attention to the harmonics of the barrel, and you can find a load that predictably will do better than another one. And I feel that 23.1 will predictably perform better than 22.3. There's always going to be that random chance because of all the external factors taking account here. We've seen how weather can affect things. We can see how brass affects things. But here, I think 23.1 is really the place to be. I'm not going to continue testing with this bullet and powder combo, though. I'm going to call it good here.